Greetings and welcome to the second of 5 lectures on polyliteracy. This is a series that is designed to help any language learner learn more effectively by giving a complete overview of what can be expected to be encountered in learning a foreign language and how to overcome the difficulties that one meets when doing that. So this is will have a good information for people who are just embarking upon their first language or who are more interested in learning to speak lots of languages, that is in polyglottery. I give the title Polyliteracy though because that's my own special interest and there's not much material available out there for it. I'm using as a textbook Robert A. Hall's New Ways to Learn a Foreign Language. It's not a new book, it's an old book, but it has a lot of valuable information, and I'm not so much updating it, but commenting on it and adding my own interpretation of it as I go along. It has 5 sections, that's why there are 5 parts to this series. Today we are on part 2, the nature of language. So let's begin by reviewing part 1, what we talked about last time. The whole concept was learning another language, and he covered the language learning problem, which is both on the sociological level, the fact that most societies are dissatisfied with the achievements of their educational system when it comes to preparing people, to producing people who have learned foreign languages, and many people who spend time learning foreign languages feel like it was time wasted rather than time well invested. So that's the language learning problem. He talks about reasons and motives for learning foreign languages. He gave 4 broad categories. I sort of commented that I saw more 3 categories, but 3 subsections of each category. So I covered 9 different reasons that people might have for learning foreign languages, and stressed that although some of the main inducing reasons, such as being compelled by circumstances or family or external forces to learn a language, are probably the most common reasons, that other reasons are under one's control, and the more reasons one has for learning a foreign language, the more likely you are to be successful in that. And then we talked about difficulties encountered in learning foreign languages, and that's the gist of this book, to sort of give a linguistic background to overcoming these difficulties. But just let it be said that, again, I made the distinction that we're talking about normal language learners, or people that I categorize as being people who are not particularly interested in learning a foreign language in general, but who find life circumstances make them, they have a special reason, a special inducement to learn a specific language at some point in their life, and therefore they want to learn this language, target language, language X. They're not particularly interested at all in learning other languages. They just want to learn this one particular language. And these are the people, because they don't have experience in language learning and they don't really know what to expect or what they're doing. These are the ones that are likely to be frustrated, feel their time is wasted. They're also likely to not enjoy the experience. They'll find it probably boring or tedious or maybe even painful. And so this series is designed to help one overcome that, because if you can experience it instead as being interesting and maybe fun or even pleasurable, you're much more likely to succeed. But let me give a warning, a caveat, that those very same characteristics of finding language learning to be fun and interesting and pleasurable are also some of the first signs of polyitis. So be warned that if you want to succeed, you may actually like what you're doing and then become more interested in learning more languages. But people who have polyitis also have encountered their own set of difficulties. In particular, they get good at sort of maybe getting started, going through textbooks, getting up to a certain level, intermediate, high intermediate level, but then usually come to a plateau at some stage and don't know what to do, how to get over that, and feel frustrated at their lack of progress after having made initial progress. But this too is a normal part of the procedure, and if one understands better what is likely to be encountered, then that at least becomes less frustrating. But there are ways of expediting the process as well. And finally, we talked about some ways of learning foreign languages, different methods and techniques that one can use. So today, we're going on to part 2, the nature of language, and Hall gives his full definition of language is as follows. Every human language is a system of oral and auditory habits located in the brain and nervous system of human individuals, and used by the members of groups to convey more or less meaningful messages to each other. And then part 2 has 5 chapters in it, and he says each of these 5 chapters is devoted to explaining or giving further details about one or more aspects of this definition. So we have chapter 5 is speaking and writing, 6 is speech habits, 7 is systems and structures, 8 is meaning, and 9 is language and society. So, chapter 5, speaking and writing. Hall starts this chapter out with what to me seems to be an overly lengthy, almost straw man argument setting up. He says that there are a lot of people out there, particularly in America, in the educational system, who believe that there are 2 forms of language, that spoken and written language are fundamentally different, that somehow spoken and written language is somehow more fundamental than spoken language. Maybe that was the case 60 years ago, but I've never encountered that sort of attitude or that idea. But he says that this is really a mistake to think that there are 2 forms of language. There's only 1 form of language, and to think that writing is somehow more fundamental than speaking. So he goes then, takes a fairly number of pages to prove that speaking is primary and writing is secondary. But again, I mean, although I love polyliteracy, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, and even after I present his argument, talk about why writing might be more important, nobody could possibly deny that speaking is primary and writing is secondary. Speaking comes first and then writing comes. And he proves this by going through history, the history of writing, the fact that writing began in some places in the Near East, the Middle East, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, whereas we know that human beings, Homo sapiens, have been around for maybe 200,000 years, and that there was a whole history of evolution going up to that. In particular, evidence of about 40,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, a cognitive revolution when something really happened to our brains, and that's when cave paintings and all these things started. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on, but the history of writing is very recent, and it's not even everywhere. The extent of literacy is totally uneven. There are societies where writing has been common, well known for a while, but in most societies, most places, it is not. It's only in the 19th century in industrialized countries that literacy approached universal literacy. So the fact is that for most of history, most people have not known how to be literate, to read or to write. And then he says that this is mirrored in the individual development of every individual human being, in that we're born and we don't speak or read or write, and we all learn how to speak first, and then we learn how to write. So the development of individual language skills. So he clearly, writing is secondary and speaking is primary. But I don't think that any of this proves that speaking is more important. I mean, just looking at this same evidence, I think you could make an argument that writing is more important. Without writing, we would not have history. We would not know anything about any societies of the past. And because literacy has been, for the most part, either a closely guarded secret or just something that was limited in scope, there's sort of been a winnowing process through history that whatever has survived to us, people took a lot of care to write that down and preserve it. So things that we find that we still can read and write, A, that's the only way we can know anything about the past, and B, a lot more care was taken into it, whereas speaking, because it is automatic and there's so much more of it, most speech is ephemeral. Most speech flies out and has no meaning and is gone. And these days, in our modern society, I think you could say most writing also is just sort of can flow out and flow. But throughout most of history, if people produced writing, it was meaningful. So yes, and the very fact that it comes after speech comes first and then writing, it shows that it's sort of a developmental phase. So it's a more difficult thing to do, a more meaningful thing to do. So That's not something I sit around and dwell on, but when somebody sets up a straw man argument, it sort of brings out the devil's advocate in me, and I want to say, well, okay, sure, speaking is primary, writing is secondary, but writing is more important. At any rate, whether you agree with that or not, it's a simple fact that you think that you can read silently and write silently, but I do believe that there's plenty of scientific studies to show that it's not. The muscles, the nerves in your brain, when you read and write, they're activated just as if you were speaking. The muscles, we learn to hold them back. And again, this is a historical development. We don't know for a fact how people read in all ancient societies, but apparently in ancient Roman society, for a while there, everybody read aloud. And when people started reading silently, when the first people were seen reading silently in some of the medieval monasteries, the other people thought that that was strange. Perhaps that's somewhat of an apocryphal story, but I think it's true that reading aloud is probably what people first did, and that's why, as a language learning technique, reading aloud is still very profitable. That's why we enjoy listening to audiobooks and making these things. But just among ourselves, left to ourselves in modern society, for the sake of speed, for the sake of not bothering other people, we tend to read without producing any noise. But our brains are still making that noise on a muscular level, and the same is true of writing. And there I think you can hear yourself articulating a bit more, even if you're not speaking aloud. So this is called subvocalization, and it always goes on, and so this is clear proof that writing and reading are based upon speaking. So that's an important thing. It has many important implications for polyliteracy. What are they? Well, you can't separate speaking and reading when you're learning a foreign language, because reading, it's not an independent thing that you do. It's based upon the speech. You need to have the sounds in order to know how the reading is there. So even if you just want to read a language, that's the main focus of polyliteracy, your brain needs to subvocalize something. So what's it going to subvocalize? It has to have some sounds in there to make in order to do the reading. And I love the way Hall articulates this. He says it's more than anything else, it's the aesthetic value, the feeling, the beauty of a language. In order to be able to read that, you have to begin by speaking it. You have to learn how the language is learn how the language is spoken, and then you can get that value, the tone, the special feeling when you're reading it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know how the language feels. And this is particularly true with literature and with poetry. And when you're reading historical languages, you are more likely than not going to be reading some sort of epic poetry, rhyming poetry. That's much more common to write in poetic form in many of the languages that we have that come down to us from the past. So languages can convey words, and they can convey, writing can convey words, but it doesn't convey intonation. It doesn't convey stress. None of this comes through when you look at a written page. Where are you going to put the emphasis? Where are you going to put the stress? Where are you going to put the emotion? That's something you have to read into it. You can read the words, you can read the ideas out of the text, but this emotion, that has to come from you. So this is particularly important, and here, again, I completely agree with him, that it's strange that more than anybody else, there are literary scholars, people who, and he calls it a delusion, and I would agree, think that it's possible that you can study the written language in isolation, that you can just learn how to read without giving your brain anything to subvocalize, that you don't need to have any sounds in your head. You can just look at the symbols and get the meaning out of them without needing to have any resonance in your head. And that is a very strange thing, particularly if you love reading literature, as literary scholars presumably do. So, what are some of our options for how to give ourselves voices in our heads to subvocalize with when we read literary languages, when we're engaged in polyliteracy? What are some of the things that we could possibly do if we are engaged in this practice? So the first thing that you could do for some languages, if you're lucky, is you can follow established examples. And these are some of the biggest languages you're most likely to be interested in doing, such as Latin and Sanskrit. These languages are not really dead languages. They're languages that might not have been spoken by a living speech community for centuries or millennia, but they've never stopped being used. They've continued being used as liturgical languages, as the languages of Catholicism and Hinduism, as scholarly languages. And so there have always been people who speak them and use them. And so there are plenty of established examples out there for you to use and follow. So some of the big ones you don't have this problem with. You can find some good examples to use. It's an option. It's not a good option, but it is what Hall mentioned. You could just ignore it. You could say, "I'm going to try. I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to bother. Whatever I subvocalize, I'll subvocal. I'm going to try to look at the symbols and just read the language." Unfortunately, even the big languages we just talked about, I mean, this is often the way Latin is taught. Instead of really ever learning to read it for pleasure, you just continuously focus on learning how to parse sentences and analyze the grammar. And so it's always a very slow and painful process reading, even in sort of college Latin classes, that you're not really reading for pleasure, you're not reading for content, you're reading to sort of analyze. So I think there are people that think that the value of Latin is in mental training and the logic of the language, and so maybe this would be fine for them, but in terms of general pleasure and getting meaning, getting at the great books that have been written in Latin, this doesn't seem to be ideal. You might still get away with doing this or be excused or have an understanding for doing this when you're just doing comparative historical linguistics with some languages that do not have any sort of major literary canon. So Gothic, for example, Gothic is the first Germanic language that we have attested. It is the only East Germanic language, so it's got the oldest form, it's got interesting forms, but there's only a fragmentary translations of the Bible by someone named Ulfilas, and so there's no original literature in it, and you would just want to analyze this. And so there are other languages in the historical continuum where we just have fragments of it and not much to read, so there's no point in putting major effort into doing that. So you might be excused with just looking at the symbols and trying to analyze them. Another thing that you can do is you can look at the text and try to make reconstructions of what the sounds were like based on what is written down. So you can try to get at phonetic accuracy by textual analysis. So any older grammar of any language, even like Gothic, I mean, it always has, in the introduction, it has a section on pronunciation where the author will give you his best guess as to how this language was actually pronounced, the specific sounds that were made in this language. And a lot of scholars spend a lot of scholarly sweat trying to get this right and imagine what the actual sounds of the language might have been like. I respect and value that endeavor, but I just fundamentally question how possible and how accurate that can ever really be. I just don't believe that you can look at a written text and go and say, oh, well, because I see the way this is written, I can tell how it sounded. I mean, just to take the example of, look at the words on this screen right now. You hear my voice the way I'm normally talking, options on how to give voice to literary languages for polyliteracy, follow established examples, ignore, focus on phonetic accuracy via textual analysis. That's the way it sounds, because that's the way I wrote it. But I can also try to put on a Southern accent like my relatives in Nashville, Tennessee use, and I could read this like this: options on how to give voice to literary languages for polyliteracy, follow established examples, ignore, focus on phonetic accuracy via textual analysis. Now, I could have written this. This could sound like this in my mind. When I subvocalize, I could be making these sounds. You would have no way of knowing that. And there are many other ways that I could read this. Yesterday, I had a delightful conversation with somebody in New Zealand. You could read this with a New Zealand accent. There are many different ways that this could sound, and I just don't think that you can look at a text and do this. Now, I think people, when they do this, because they're looking at manuscripts, because they're looking at things that were written by hand in non-standardized form, they feel they have more clues. But I just don't think that there's no way you could ever verify it. You're not going to find somebody who's maybe we'll find somebody who's frozen in a cave and bring them back to life and hear somebody talk from 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, but I don't think that's very likely. And that's part of the problem that I have with this approach. The other part of the problem I have with this approach is that people who do this, they spend so much time and effort on getting the specific phonetics right, but it doesn't have to be this way, it just is, that they don't seem to do very much with that other important part of pronunciation, which is the rhythm, the intonation, the musicality of the language. And so they might have a very solid, cogent argument for why this specific sound is produced in this specific fashion, but nonetheless, when they read it, if they're American, they still sound like they're speaking English. It doesn't sound like a foreign language at all. They're still speaking basically American English on top of it with these other sounds. Similar with European scholars or other people. I have here the entire set of Assimil's ancient language series. So I've got Sanskrit and Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's hard to hold things up so they're clear. Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. And everybody who watches my videos knows how much I respect this method and this firm. And you see how thick these books are. These are all absolutely 100% excellent books to be recommended for all of these languages. The books, all 4 of these books, are outstanding. The recordings, I don't really find them usable. The Latin on here, I think that they have re-recorded it. I don't have the re-recordings, maybe a caveat. They may have put in either standard church Latin or restored pronunciation. But this here is a classic example, classic example of basically they're speaking French underneath this, and it doesn't sound any different from that. Here, they have made the argument that ancient Greek was actually a tonal language, similar to Chinese, and tried to reproduce that. The effects are very strange to listen to. Egyptian here, again, it's nice to have something to sub-vocalize, but I feel like it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, I don't have any idea how you would verify it, and it sounds kind of like Klingon to me. There are 4 speakers on the recordings for this, and 3 of them are fine, but one of them reads in this really exaggerated fashion that makes it impossible to want to shadow it or even listen to it. And unfortunately, I think he's the pundit. I think he's the main scholar, and he's doing that with best of intentions. But the way it is so exaggerated, it's hard to follow. So enough on that. That's one thing that you could do. Another thing you could do is you can work backwards. You can, for all of these, I mean, not with Sumerian and not with maybe some other languages, but most ancient or medieval literary languages have living modern descendants. And in these cases, it is often, probably most of the time, it is a good idea to learn one of these descendants first. First and foremost, this is a simple fact. I mean, all of these ancient Indo-European languages, at least, are highly inflected, much more complex grammatically than their living descendants are. So if you learn the modern version of it and then go backwards, it's easier to get entry into the language. So you understand a lot, and then the forms can become more similar. Whereas if you just learn them flat out, there's a lot of there are a lot of irregularities in forms to learn. So apart from giving yourself a voice, you could facilitate the entry into that. Now, if you just know, I want to read Homer, I don't have any interest in going to Greece or speaking with Greeks. Why should I bother learning modern Greek in order to learn Homer? Then you're getting into the sort of sub-vocalization argument. Again, for Latin and Sanskrit, both because they have so many descendants, and none of them are, you can say that's the direct descendant of this language, and you have so many examples that also might not be necessary. But certainly there are some other languages where I would say definitely it only makes sense to take this approach. So I'm thinking in particular of Old Norse, which I wrote my dissertation. And the fact is that Old Norse and modern Icelandic are extremely similar. It's probably less changed than any other language. And if you learned Icelandic, basically you've learned Old Norse, and then you just have to learn the different vocabulary and different structure and the like. And I would say also some of the other richest medieval literary languages are Middle High German, which has a direct descendant of Modern High German, and Old French to Modern French, and Occitan, which also could be argued to go into Modern French, but also maybe better to Catalan, say. And as I pointed out earlier in another video, that almost all of these books are available in bilingual text editions. So you have the Old High German here, and Middle High German here, and the Modern German here. You have the Middle High German here, and the Modern German here. So it's so easy to see and compare them. You have the Old French on one page, and the Modern French translation on the other page. And so it only makes sense to be able to do that comparatively. Here you have the Provençal Troubadour, complete troubadour poetry here, wonderful edition. And as I said, it might make more sense to look at medieval Occitan on one page and modern Catalan on the other. And maybe there are editions like that that are just rare and I haven't been able to get my hands on. But there's a lot of things where you have Occitan and French side by side. So just for that comparative aspect, I think it's really a good idea to do that. So, and then once you've done that, you do have the option of just saying, working backwards, I'm going to use the grandchild's voice. I'm going to read ancient Greek and I'm going to pronounce it like modern Greek. I'm going to read Middle High German and pronounce it like modern German. I know it's not authentic, but it turned into this, and I'm never going to meet anybody that speaks the way the old people spoke. And if I do this, people will understand me, and maybe I'll attract them to do this. So that's an option that you could just do that. I think it's a better option to maybe to do that, but then go back up to the people who practice all the phonetic accuracy and do sort of a combination. I mean, basically read Middle High German like modern German, but know that Middle High German had a lot of long vowels that modern German doesn't have, and so make sure you put those in. You just give it a special twist to do that. So that's an option. So these are reasons for working backwards chronologically. I think a really nice option, really good thing you can do, and again, this works best with medieval literary languages. Old Norse, Middle High German, Old French, Provençal Occitan. All of these languages, because they wrote so much poetry, have been put to music. All sorts of wonderful ensembles for early music groups have taken these songs, these poems, and put them into music. So they undoubtedly were working with phonetic accuracy, and they were doing their best interpretation. And that's something kind of living that you can hear. I mean, you're not going to meet any really living descendants who do this. You are going to meet people who have made, you can listen to people who were bringing this poetry to life. I mean, that's what it's all about, really, is honoring the literary legacy, and not, I don't think we need to obsess and focus on, is this 100% right? Is this the way they actually sounded? Rather than saying, okay, they wrote this, this has meaning, and I'm bringing it to life, and here's what my interpretation of it sounds like. So I think that you can take the lead of these groups and combine that with something that I know I've talked about at some point in the past, learned from, I forget his name, the guy who does the whole series of acting with an accent tapes. And he talks about there being a locus, an axis of pronunciation in any given accent in your voice that you can visualize as a spinning golden ball. So you can find that spinning golden ball if you think about it. So when I'm speaking in my normal voice right now, I would say the spinning golden ball, the locus of the axis, is pretty much in the center and top of my mouth. It's towards my palate. It's floating up and up above my tongue and towards my palate. Whereas when I try to go and put on my Nashville, Tennessee accent, I have not swallowed completely that golden ball, but I have taken it back into my throat. It is down. It's like on the top of my, it's in my glottis. It's going down into my throat. So all I'm doing when I switch from this accent to this accent is I'm shifting that locus of pronunciation. I'm visualizing a golden ball spinning, and all the sounds are coming out of that. And of course, I have to know what those specific sounds like by doing the textual analysis, by having some phonetic accuracy so that I can make that. But the important thing is that it's capturing some musicality. So I think it would be a perfectly valid thing to do, to take ownership of something like one of these wonderful ancient texts and produce a personal narrative of it by really getting into that feeling. Use a musical group as your thing, as your inspiration. How do they make the sounds? Study some phonetic accuracy, learn the modern descendant well, and then just feel a golden ball and produce a full-scale audio version of one of these things. I think that would be a wonderful polyglot practice thing to do. I don't know of any full-scale renditions of any medieval text, except there was a German professor of Germanistik, Peter Wapniewski, and he did do versions of Tristan and of Parzival and the Nibelungenlied, in which he narrates and he recites a little bit and he tells the story and he interprets and he does a little bit of reading of Middle High German and then Modern German side to side. So that's somebody that you can hear for that. But for Old French or other languages, I think we're kind of left on our own, except for the lead of early music groups. So I think that they're a valuable thing to follow. Okay, now on to chapter 6, about speech habits. Speech habits, he starts out, Hall, by saying that we have the illusion of complete freedom. We think that we can say whatever we want whenever we want to say it, but it's the same way we think that we can walk wherever you want. And in point of fact, you can now, but it's such a complex procedure knowing how to walk. So much muscle movement has to go and things come together. It's the same thing with our speech habits. We kind of think that we're in control, but we forget how much habit training went into producing this. You can feel this throughout the entire range of everything that we do when we speak. First and foremost, with pronunciation. I mean, you don't think about it, you just do it. But in order to make any particular sound, you have to put your tongue just in the right place, or your teeth, or your lips, and you have to stop the air or push the air out in a certain way. So your lungs are working, your lips are working, your tongue is working, your nose is working, and they have to do this and do it very rapidly, because a word is composed of lots of sounds, and then a phrase is composed of lots of words, and all of these are just going very fast. So all of your vocal organs are moving with incredible rapidity and incredible coordination. They're doing this wonderful dance, and you only notice that when something goes wrong. When you, as I did a few moments ago, when you have a spoonerism, you transpose sounds, or when you're speaking a foreign language or somebody pronounces something incorrectly, that's when you notice something. But for the most part, we just utterly take this for granted. It's not just pronunciation, it's all other levels of linguistic structure. So forming the past tense of verbs, putting words into certain order, knowing how things are phrased. I mean, you just do it. Strong verbs, weak verbs, putting verbs and words and everything to make a comprehensible sentence instead of producing gibberish. But this is something that you've got years of training and habit formation that has enabled you to get to doing this. So continuing the same ideas, same arguments, he says, when we're learning a foreign language, it's necessary for us to realize the great role that habit plays in our language behavior and the relatively small share that conscious analysis or reason has in it, so that we may understand the type of work that has to be done in learning a new language. He points out there are 3 kinds of learning, not just language learning, all kinds of learning. We have 2 kinds of learning. The first 2 are content and attitude. So content is facts, might be, for example, who wrote this book? What was his name? When was he born? When did he die? What did he do? What is in the book? What are the facts in the book? Is it a history book? It tells us of this king. What was the king's name? What did he do? When did he do this? Content. Attitude is our valuation or judgment to this work. Do we classify this as one of the great books Is there something of meaning and value in here that we should be getting out of it? Is it something that can form our whole system of cognition and understanding and values and morality? Is there something that we should be getting out of it? That's attitude. So both of these, obviously, do require a lot of intellectual analysis. However, habit is the third kind of learning that we do. And we do this in lots of things. But when it comes to language learning, particularly elementary language learning, we should just be building up action patterns through repeated practice. We should just be, he's kind of pre-behavioristic, but this is a time for behaviorism. This is a time for imprinting. This is a time for just building up the correct patterns. And he says that when it comes, still talking about elementary language learning, intellectual analysis should only play a role. It's only valuable if you find, hey, this is a hard pattern to form. What is this pattern? How can I understand how to do it? And particularly if I have difficulties making this pattern, overcoming my previous habits, overcoming the habits of my native language to get to this pattern, how can I do that? So again, the easiest examples are with phonetic analysis. If I need to develop the pattern of making a sound that doesn't exist in my native language, I need to understand what to do with my tongue, and I need to physically practice putting my tongue into that position. So I need to understand where to put my tongue. Somebody needs to explain that to me. I need to see a diagram. I need to understand the kind of sound it is, a fricative sound or plosive or whatever you want to call it, and how to make it, and how to overcome what I would do in my native language. Chapter 7, he calls systems and structures, and it's just a fast overview of the different branches of linguistics that you could focus on. We were just talking about phonics or phonetics, and so he's building up to levels of meaning here. So he has several structures, and he's got a diagram. I'm actually flipping it around because when he puts it into text, he starts out on this level, but in his diagram, this is at the bottom. So phonetics are just the physical sounds of speech, just in isolation. What sounds are in this language? Is there a p? Is there a b? Is there a k? What sounds are in the language? And then if you take the sounds and you say, well, wait a minute, these aren't just sounds. These are go from phonetics to phonemics. These are phonological habits. These form functional units. The best way of thinking of this is these form minimal pairs. I can say bat or bet. I can say bad or bed. Okay, in each of these cases, there's the same b and d sound, but the medial sound, the different vowel sounds, they cause different meanings. So there's a value to them. They form functional units. Those are minimal pairs. They mean different things because of the different sounds. So phonemics is based on phonetics, but it's when you instead of just physically describing the sounds, oh, this is a sound that's made by stopping the air and then letting it out. This is a sound that's made with the nose or with the lips. You're going to the level of saying, this is a sound that distinguishes between these pairs of words. Then you come to morphological habits or morphology, morphemes. Morpheme is he describes as the minimum functional unit of form. He gives the example of the word feeling or happiness or feeling, he says. So you can break that into feel-ing, and ing is a morpheme that is not a word. Feel is. And you could take the L off of feel and get fee, which is another word, but it's a totally different meaning. So you can't break feeling down anymore. So there are two morphemes in there, feeling, in getting to different structures of form. And then you would put these morphemes together to form syntax or sentence order or syntactical habits. Constructions, when you take meaningful combinations of forms and the feeling of happiness or something. It's not necessarily a full sentence. It can be a clause or a phrase, but when you put words together, that's syntax. And then he's building up to meaning, and then defining words, that's the ultimate level of meaning, although it's kind of outside of this sort of ladder that he's been building up to. That's the lexical habit when you get to the dictionary meaning of words, so knowing what things mean. So language is a system, and it has structure, and these are some of the components of it that it behooves us to understand. As a continuation of chapter 7, apart from the structure, he says that, it is a fact that language is always changing. Language is consistently in movement. And so there are always old sounds and forms and constructions, words that are going out of use and new ones that are coming in. It's a living continuum. People didn't say often when I was young. They say it now. I used to say often. So there's a T creeping in there. There's strange things that people are doing with pronouns these days, because I'm one of these old conservative speakers. I don't like the changes that are going on. I like the way it used to be. But whether I like it or not, it's a fact that language is growing and changing, and there are things that used to be considered incorrect or not right that are now, and this is something that needs to be taken into consideration too when you are learning a foreign language. The fact that at any given time, particularly if you're working, and I strongly value and encourage people to use good methods that might be 50, 60 years old, you're going to learn some things in there that are obsolete. I mean, the wonderful Assimile le Russe is, you're talking about the Soviet Union. I mean, there's plenty of things in there that are no longer relative in many ways, but if they're a really excellent method for learning the language that will bring it alive to you, and you need to know about that too, that's still worth knowing. At any rate, this is stuff that is important to know at the intermediate and the advanced level, not so much at the beginning level, but you do need to know there are these historical considerations. Chapter 8 moves on to meaning. Meaning is semantics, and he says the basic function of language here is to weld human communities together, get people into it, form people into a community, and once you're in a community, enable people to cooperate with each other, understand each other, communicate with each other. So that's the basic function of language. And he says that how do we know the meaning of any particular linguistic form or construction is the situation when you use it. You can't divorce it from its actual use. It has to be put into context. So he gives an example of language being, the value of language being facilitated by displacement. Displaced speech, reference outside of physical context. And he says that's what makes language so useful as a tool that can bring communities together. So for example, I have my cat Merlin here right now. He's a perfect example. Anybody who's seeing any of my videos from now on, whether Merlin is in the picture right now, as he is, will understand if I say my cat. That happens to be the exact example that Hall gives, my cat. You'll understand what my cat means, whether you know it or not. When I say my cat, I mean him. I mean this gentleman wearing a tuxedo right next to me. I do not mean some orange striped tabby or some other cat. My cat means him. And now that you know that, you see that he doesn't need to be in the picture. When I talk about my cat, you'll understand that this is whom I mean. There are in meaning, it involves both physical meaning and also literal meaning, and also intellectual and emotional meaning is conveyed by this. So if you look at the objective meaning or the dictionary meaning of something, that's a constant thing that you can have, the denotation. So the dictionary definition of a cat is a feline, a domesticated feline. Now you can go into all the definitions of a cat, that's him. But when you come to my cat, the subjective meanings, the connotation of my cat, I think you can see that we are very good friends. So my feelings towards him, his feelings towards me, there's connotations in there that are subjective meanings that you can't convey so well outside of the meaning of the listing for the situation in respect to what it's used. So when I say my cat, you're not just going to think of, oh, yes, his cat is a black and white tuxedo cat. You're also going to think, well, his cat seems to be very friendly, comes into his videos. He obviously, they've got a close bond. You're going to see that kind of thing, but you're not going to find that in a dictionary definition. You're just going to find a feline, domesticated feline. Thank you for being such a good prompt tonight. Chapter 8, meanings continued. He says it's interesting when we think about meanings that what seems perfectly normal, 100%, this is why he talked about the value of learning a foreign language being that it expands your mind, because you realize things don't have to be phrased that you do. But what seems perfectly normal to speakers of one language, it's not normal. It's not even necessary. It doesn't even exist in speakers of another language. So he gives some great examples of ways that languages, we talked last time, or the time, I think it was last time, yeah, about, for example, colors. People seeing totally different color spectra. And I don't know how much anthropologically it's validated, people not knowing how to count small numbers, large numbers, things like this. But we would expect, based on our knowledge of our own one language, if we're monolinguals, that, oh, the way we do it seems so simple, it seems so obvious, universal, that there must be words like that in another language. So he gives some examples of, in Western European languages, we all have languages, words like to have or to be. It seems so obvious. But not all languages have these. Russian and Hindi and Korean really express these in different ways. And even in the Western European context, you have Spanish has two different words for to be, depending on whether it's permanent or whether it's identity or whether it's in position or place. And that's obvious to them that you would need that distinction, but we don't make that in a lot of other languages. Definite articles to say a cat or the cat, as opposed to just saying cat. Whichever one you come from, it seems so obvious that you would need to do that or not need to do that. And then you come to the other one and it seems so strange that they don't do that. But both, that's a fundamental distinction because you use articles, definite articles so much. Likewise, demonstrative pronouns. Some languages only have two, this, that. You can say this here, that there, but basically just have this and that. Whereas other languages have 2, 3 numbers of specific things. So I don't have to say that there, it's built into the word. So it seems obvious in some languages that you need a trifold or a fourfold distinction. In other languages, you only need a twofold distinction. The whole issue of gender. Again, in some languages, you don't have a word it. Everything is he or she. And then other languages, you don't have a way of making a distinction between he or she. It's basically just all it. That third person singular pronoun. It's used for male or for female. So it seems perfectly obvious to you if you speak one of these languages, that's the way it should be, but then you come to another language, like, whoa, I need to make a distinction there. Why? Verbal conjugation. If you come from a European background, you read other European languages, you have to learn the specific things, but still it's clear that, yeah, I'm saying, how do I conjugate a verb? I do it by tense. Is it present tense? Is it past tense? And I do it by person. First person, second person, third person, singular, plural. Of course, that's the way it should be. It's the way it is in English. That's the way it is in German. It's the way it is in French. Then I go to Korean, and it's like, wait a minute. In Korean, verbs there's no difference between I eat and you eat and she eats. It's all eat. But it shows in the way that you say that, whether you're talking to somebody who's older than you, who's younger than you, who's when you're in a formal situation or respectful, it shows politeness, it shows respect, it shows some sort of social connection thing. So verbs are used in a very, very different fashion. So we tend also to think about our own language that we forget that language is constantly growing and changes, and we think, oh, this is the way it is, this is right, and this is the way it must always be. But it is not the case. I mean, he gives the example in his book about nice having not always meant nice. Nice meant many different things. Girl used to be any child. Just pick up the compare a King James Bible with any other modern translation of the same chapter, and this just in every verse you're going to find something that's slightly different. I mean, meat did not used to be flesh of a dead animal. It was just food. I mean, there's constantly changing semantics of language. Finally, in his section on language and society, he talks about different layers or levels of language, ways of speaking that we all have. Everybody has an idiolect. the specific way that an individual talks, all the speech habits that that one person has. I mean, you know this right away when you answer the phone and you hear somebody say hello, and you know exactly who it is, if it's a good friend or family member, just from that one word. And all the particular vocabulary that you use, the way that you've grown. People ask about my idiolect because I speak in a kind of strange way because I've lived half my life in different countries. I've been divorced from the group that I came from. I've been practicing intuitively speaking loudly and clearly to people for whom English is not their native language. And meanwhile, the language has been growing and changing while I've been away, and that T has crept into often, and other things have been happening. So I meet my friends from college after I haven't seen them for a couple of decades, and they say, "You speak funny. What happened to you?" My idiolect has not kept up with their specific way of speaking. So obviously we're all speaking English as the language, but we're also speaking our different dialects of it. And dialects have many meanings. The most common meaning is sort of the regional accent that you have. So I put on the dialect of the, gosh, what would you call the Tennessee area, sort of the Mid-South. But there's something that's the regional aspect of the dialect. But there's also a sociolect. A sociolect is sort of the level of, in some societies, I think that blacksmiths speak a certain way and cobblers speak another way. So it depends on your job, your income level, your background, your educational level. All of these things are part of your sociolect. And that is distinguished into, back to Hall's terminology, languages have a dialect. He talks about you have standard versus non-standard speech, which basically comes down to educated versus uneducated speech. And you have formal versus informal speech, which I call register. And I think there's more than just a simple formal, informal way. Register is, you have many different ways of speaking. I have one way of speaking when I am delivering a lecture. I have another way of speaking when I'm talking to my family, to my cat. I have another way of speaking when I'm talking to my college friends. I have another way of speaking when I'm talking to other different groups of people. So different registers, yes, different layers of formality, but it's also just different contexts of use of language. Hall points out that native speakers of a lot of languages have a lot of really fixed, firm beliefs that this is correct, this is the way it's supposed to be, and often they're wrong. It's just not the case. They really think that something is one way, and it's not. And that's when you confront them with that, they can be very surprised and maybe even upset, but that's a fact. And what does he mean by correct? He says correct is what is socially acceptable. So if you're educated and you learn that you should do something, you should put 2 spaces after a period, or you should not pronounce the T and often, or you can get kind of attached to certain ways of doing things, and then whenever other people do it differently, and if everybody goes around just putting 1 space after a period now, then that becomes correct. He also points out this very interesting fact that there are some languages where the speakers of the language, they have totally different standards and different ideals for what they want in usage from non-native speakers. And this is why I tend to favor formal registers. I like learning the top register of foreign languages because I guess I've encountered this and intuited this on myself. There are a lot of people who really appreciate that you speak their language at that high formal level, even if it's old-fashioned, even if it's sort of, they don't do it themselves, but when they meet you and you speak that way, they appreciate that. Whereas if you're too informal, it's kind of, they're not so happy about that. So that concludes part 2, and next time we will go on to part 3, building new language habits. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, that Matthew, who was on the discussion circle last time, kindly provided a PDF of this out-of-print book. And so if you want to get the most out of these lectures as take it like a class. Here's your homework. For next time, I want you to read about the next 25 pages. There are 4 chapters: imitating and memorizing, discovering the patterns, practicing the patterns, and reviewing and improvising. And so if you found today's lecture interesting and you didn't read it, you might want to go back. I'll put the link to the PDF in the description. You might want to read today's chapters, but before next week, maybe you want to read these to get the most out of the lecture. As before, I'm going to follow this lecture up with a discussion circle. I'm going to hold it on Zoom next Friday at 4 o'clock my time, Central Standard United States time, Chicago time. I will put the link in the description again of how you can fill out a contact form and tell me that I would like to be in this. My goal is to have about 4 people in this. And last time, my mistake, I'm sorry. I just sent the Zoom link to the first 4 people who told me they were interested, because I just thought, oh, okay, they're the 4 people. It was stupid of me not to realize that people could have problems accessing the Zoom link or something might come up. So we ended up with only 2 people. We had a great discussion, but I would like to give more people a chance and give everybody a turn. So in particular, if you're one of the, I think 15 people ultimately wrote last time, and you still want to be in that, write again, and I will definitely put you at the top of the list, because you said you were interested before and you didn't get a chance this time. But what I'd like to do this time is give more people the link, and hope that if I give the link to 8 people, that yes, 4 people will show up, and if 5 people show up and I don't let you in, I will apologize profusely and promise definitely that you will come in the next time. But I'd like to have a slightly larger group to have a more vivid conversation and with different points of view. And I will expect and ask that if you want to be on this, definitely you should do the reading so that we can start first and foremost with discussing these chapters in part 2 of Hall's book. And I will also ask you to sort of read the chapters and to look at the comment section. Hopefully we'll get lots of comments and questions in there, and we need to go through those the way I did in my own question and answer videos, go through the questions that come in and make sure we discuss what people who didn't get to come onto the Zoom call, what their questions were, and then we can continue with taking the conversation and discussion in whichever direction it goes, and hope that it's just as interesting and stimulating for everybody as was the one last week. So thank you very much for listening and for your interest, and goodbye, and I will talk to you next time.